Hello, welcome to Naomi's Bookshelf. Today we're going to talk about Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. So if you're new to my channel, I do this series called Timeless Tomes where I talk about big classics, so classics that are over the 500-page marker in any edition. I don't count specific editions. So this edition I have is just about 400 pages. However, many editions of Mansfield Park are over that 500-page marker, so this one counts in my opinion for my series. So I have decided to put this one in for my special Jane Austen July edition of Timeless Tomes. And I want to do a spoiler-free section first, as I always do, and a spoilery section. This worked perfectly because Jane Austen July is doing a read-along of this book. So many people will have thoughts of this, but also many people might have been trying to get into this and not sure why it is so difficult. So if you are struggling to get into it or context-wise, I will happily give you a spoiler-free intro and theme-wise if you would like to have insight. But also if you want spoilers into the book context, you're welcome to stay around for the whole video. Why not? I would also like to suggest that if you are interested in big classics, you can always subscribe. I put out one of these videos about once a month or once every 2 months. I try to read at least every 2 months a big classic. So you can always hit that subscribe button if you would like for regular classics content from me. Anyways, let's get into Mansfield Park. So Mansfield Park is about Fanny Price on the first glance, and I think it's about more than that. I think Mansfield Park is really about the property and everyone around Mansfield Park or in Mansfield Park who's living there. I think it's much more than Fanny Price, and I think it does it injustice to just say it's about Fanny Price, because as Fanny Price is our main character, if we can call her that, I do think this is an ensemble book, and I think it's a brilliantly written ensemble book. However, I do think this is I think it leads you astray if you think Fanny Price is going to be a loud and vivacious main character. If you walk into this one thinking, oh, it's like Emma, where Emma is obviously loud and the main character, you're going to be disappointed. Also, if you think this is going to be like Pride and Prejudice, where, Lizzie Bennet is obviously the main character, it's not going to be that way. Northanger Abbey, obviously Catherine Morland's the heroine. She says it right there. It says it right in the main, first sentence about her. It's not the same thing. This book is about the people in and around Mansfield Park, in my personal opinion. This book follows a group of people who are one family mostly, as they are essentially growing up together, and we see the book through Fanny's eyes, I would call it. I would also say that this book is following Fanny's moral compass. We see the book through Fanny's eyes, and she is our moral compass as we follow the book, in my personal opinion. She is what guides us as the reader into what is actually going on and what is right and who we should trust. She is our guide, and I think she's a wonderful guide. However, she is not a loud and flashy guide. She is a quiet and subtle guide. So if you're looking for something a little different, be prepared. It is not a flashy book. There are flashy characters, but she is not our flashy guide. Something else that can throw people off of Mansfield Park if you've never read it before is that Edmund Bertram and Fanny Price are first cousins. Now, you might think that's a spoiler, and I personally don't, because it's kind of mentioned in the first couple chapters that Fanny Price is in love with Edmund Bertram, and I personally don't think it's a spoiler because it's so early in the book and they are first cousins. So you'll have to acknowledge that and kind of move on if you are not able to see it for what it is as the times. There are cousins who try to get married in that time era. Being Mr. Collins trying to marry his second cousin in Pride and Prejudice, but I know it's second cousin, and it's just part of that day and age. So it's something we have to recognize is part of Mansfield Park. So something else, if you've never read the book or have never realized that that's actually their relationship and how close their bloodlines are, just so you're aware. So several themes of Mansfield Park are about family. There is a lot of dysfunctional families going on in here. We have the three sisters who have very dysfunctional familial relationship. You have Lady Bertram, Mrs. Price, and Mrs. Norris. So Lady Bertram married well, and therefore it enabled her sister, Mrs. Norris, to marry well. Not as well, but better than her station, which is an interesting discussion of class in this book, because also Fanny Price is brought up, but at the same time, she's not expected to marry up. Then you also have Mrs. Price, who is the one who left that higher elevated status due to Lady Bertram and married beneath her newly elevated status. And so all of these three have a very different view on marriage and elevation of wealth or status. So it's just a really interesting discussion on that familial dysfunction. Then you also have the siblings that are beneath them, being the Bertram siblings, and their discussions there of Tom Bertram being very irresponsible and being the eldest son. And he's still due to inherit, even though he does not deserve it in his actions. Edmund Bertram is very responsible around the home property. He is very responsible with his living as he's going into the church. And then you also have the girls who Maria Bertram, as the eldest, is not responsible in her love life. However, she is the eldest and she is also engaged at a certain point in the book. And then you also have the youngest, who is not engaged and is kind of more responsible in some ways. So it's a different kind of dynamic there. You also have Fanny, who's pushed into the middle of this family and no one really wants her. Lady Bertram wants her for what she can get out of her at the beginning, like as a companion, as a helper. Edmund Bertram wants her as a friend. So Edmund Bertram is the only one who wants her as she is. The girls don't care about her aside from being bullied to her in a way or laughing at her for her ignorance. Mrs. Norris does not want anything to do with her, aside from just making her do everything she does not want to do. And it's just a very interesting family discussion, I think, in this book. We also have discussion of town versus home life or country life. Town people and then the country people, and when the town people come in, being the Crawfords, what happens and how the different ideals come together. It's a very interesting discussion as well in the book. And I think this book is full of discussion. It's a very slow build book. You can't just read it for the first time and expect fireworks. You have to invest time. This is a book that you should read a chapter at a time, chew in your mind slowly, methodically, and then move on to the next chapter. It's not something that you can just fly through, because if you do, I think you'll miss a lot of gems. There are some things in here that you need to wait on, sit in, think on, and as you do, you'll realize how amazing some of these books are, or how amazing some of these characters are, how developed these storylines are and plot lines are. Just the way that Jane Austen has created this complex world and the complex relationships, and the way that she I don't know how to describe it. It's such an interesting one, and I think it's an interesting one because there's no heroes. There's no villains. I mean, Fanny is a hero in my opinion. And I know some people would say otherwise. I made a very ranty video, which is very spoilery, so I'll link it up there. It's actually up there, but anyways. I think this is a very interesting book because it's about complex humans and how no one is simple. And I think it's a very interesting one. So that's my spoiler-free discussion part of this. So let's get into some spoilery parts, because I do want to talk about some things in particular. And I want to kind of set the stage for this. So one thing that I do want to kind of really touch on is Henry Crawford. I think he's a really interesting anti-hero. I'm not going to call him a villain because I don't think he is villainous in a true villain way. He's not villainy like Wickham. He's not a villain like Willoughby. He's a villain in a different kind of sense. That's why I'm not thinking he's a villain. I think he's like an anti-hero. He's like the opposite side of Edmund. But at the same time, they're very similar in my personal opinion. I know this would be very controversial, but I think they're both very kind of flip-floppy in their ways. But Henry Crawford stands out in that regard. He intentionally goes after women's hearts, and he intentionally tries to reel them in. And I think that's interesting because he then gets reeled in by himself. Like, he intentionally goes out for Fanny's heart and he gets caught himself. And I think he makes one of the most true statements about Fanny that I read in the book. And I thought it was brilliant because it stood out to me as being a very accurate assessment of her as a person, and I want to read it. So Henry Crawford is talking to Mary, his sister, and they're just talking about Fanny. I don't remember the exact situation why, but they are, and he says, "Had you seen her this morning, Mary," he continued, "attending with such ineffable sweetness and patience to all the demands of her aunt's stupidity, working with her and for her, her color beautifully heightened as she leaned over the work, then returning to her seat to finish a note which she had previously engaged in writing for that stupid woman's service, and all with which such unpretending gentleness, so much as if it were a matter of course that she did not have a moment at her own command. Her hair arranged as neatly as it always is, and one little curl falling forward as she wrote, which she now and then shook back, and in the midst of it all, still speaking at intervals to me, or listening, and as if she liked to listen to what I had said. Had you seen her so, Mary, you would not have implied the possibility of her power over my heart ever ceasing." So at that point, I think Henry Crawford is really describing her ability to see others and care for others also while having control of herself. I think Fanny's a really great multitasker. I think it's really interesting how that all plays out, and I really thought that's a great description of her. So we rarely, in my personal opinion, see a description of Fanny in this book because we see the book through Fanny's eyes. If I were to describe my way of seeing this book, I view Mansfield Park in a way like a stage. Mansfield Park, the house, is a stage. It is a stage with all of the people in this house being actors. The characters are state actors in the play, including the Crawfords, anyone who's on the property or near the property. However, Fanny is like the audience, or shall we say the producer, who's leading the audience through what's going on. And I think that's how it works. I think she shows us what's happening, and she shows us how we should feel about it, what's going on, and how it works. And I think when it comes to certain moral events, we can see how things are building. She really directs us as the reader into, situations where when Henry Crawford and Maria are sneaking into the forest or wherever that was, she lets us in on this thing that, you know what, that's a bad sign. Something's happening there. And who cares if he rode in the carriage with Julia? Something's going on there. And it's a good point to us as the audience, as the reader, that something's going on and Fanny's caught it. I think she's able to tell us with her intuitions when something's wrong. So I think Fanny is a perfect director for us if we are watching a play of Mansfield Park. I think another big theme in this book is discretion and foresight and insight. A lot of those terms can be interchanged, I think, when it comes to certain characters. And the lack of it, or the insight, or the extra ability to have that insight. So when it comes to the Crawfords, Fanny obviously has extreme insight. However, the Bertrams all are lacking insight and they are lacking discretion. But Mrs. Norris, I think, is really interesting in the way that she does not have any discretion when it comes to personal matters, when it comes to pushing people into situations. She does not have any discretion at all. She really is pushing her own agenda. And if you're recognizing the name Mrs. Norris, yes, that is the cat from Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling named the cat after Mrs. Norris from here, because that character is that awful. I think it's an interesting touch, because Mrs. Norris deserves a lot of things. If anyone's a villain in this book, it's Mrs. Norris. I will give one villain, Mrs. Norris, true villain. But I think discretion is a big discussion in this book, because so many times people are saying, I can see things clearly, or I'm aware of everything going around, and they're not. They're completely oblivious to the point, or oblivious to true character. There are so many situations where, you know, the play's happening and Mrs. Norris like, it's fine, it's great. And Lady Bertram's like, the kids are having such a great time. And no one is really aware what's going on except for Fanny. And that's what I mean by Fanny's our moral compass. I think Fanny is the moral guide. Her true north is the one that guides us to what is actually correct behavior in this book and what is not. It shows us truly what's appropriate. And then we see when other situations happen, like I said before with Henry Crawford and Mariah running into the forest, she knows that that's wrong, and we can see through her eyes something's inappropriate. And we also know that, but at the same time, it's lost sometimes through the cultural lens that we are now in our modern age. So I think Fanny gives us insight and perception, and many characters are lacking that. Like Mr. Rushforth, even then, he did not see what was wrong in front of his own eyes. He kind of did, but at the same time, he was missing what was there. And everyone else thought, oh, it's just an innocent flirtation. And it's not. She's an engaged woman, and yet everyone is just thinking it's fine. No, it's not. And people needed to recognize that, but they decided to ignore it. So this idea of discretion, this idea of insight, or discernment is really important, I think, in this book. I think a lot of people need it, and I think when people start to receive it or start to understand the value is when it's becoming important. Like Sir Thomas Bertram, when he comes home, or whenever he's present, things start to change a bit for the better. But he also was lacking it because when Fanny is proposed to, and she does not want to accept, and he's like, I will force you to accept by sending you home so you can understand how good you've got it. It's like, she's like, I'm not gonna cave. Like, she almost does, but then, you know, circumstances change. But at the same time, it's just, he thinks he knows best, but at the same time, he is not truly understanding what's going on in his own home, and no one really cares about what Fanny sees. And I think another interesting fact is that Fanny's basically treated like a servant in a lot of ways. I think she's basically treated like a governess is in a lot of Victorian literature, where they're not quite a servant, but they're not the family. And I think a lot of the time a servant or a governess or a companion, like in Fanny's case, can see things that family members don't. A lot of things are visible to them that other people do not see because they are invisible many times. And I think that's important to recognize, because Fanny was many times in the room in this book without being like talked to or being talked about, or we wouldn't hear about her until too late, or she'd be discussed and suddenly it's like, where's Fanny? And it's, oh, there she is. But I think it's just something of note, because she would be present, but no one would recognize that she's there. So she could overhear conversations. She could be aware of things that no one else would. And so she had the ability to see and overhear and be there, and no one else would recognize it. And so because of her situation in the home, I think she was more capable of understanding what was going on. And I think that's something else important to see. Even with her limited life experience, I think that's something else we need to recognize about Fanny's character, that she does have this background of, you know, being able to observe family situations and being able to observe what's going on within the home itself. Another thing I want to talk about, which is kind of out of order, but still I want to talk about it, is Mariah's engagement, which I think is also of note because at the beginning of the book, Mariah enters this engagement where basically she's going to get a lot of money out of it. That's the only thing of value. And her fiance, Mr. Rushworth, is very lacking in intelligence. He is still worth respect and still worth value, and he's still worthy of love. There's no question of that in my mind. And I think he still needs to be treated with those intentions. And I think the problem is that Mariah just wants to marry him for money. Now, everyone else in her life is saying this is a great match because, of course, they're wanting to marry up, and that means money. However, Edmund Bertram is saying, Edmund, her younger brother, is saying, or no, he's older, but he's the youngest brother of the family, is saying this is not a good idea. And everyone in the family is saying, yes, this is, except for her father, who is away and currently saying, let me just meet him first. And then eventually he just says, wait until I get back before we actually make this official kind of idea. I think that's how it goes. I can't remember the exact thing or exact wording of it, but basically everyone approves except for Edmund and Fanny. And I think that speaks to Edmund's ability to see at the beginning, but I think it also sets this marriage up for failure when it shows that everyone there is just money hungry and no one really cares at that point for their feelings. And later it comes to show that Mariah should never have entered this marriage just for the money, because she was engaged to a man that she didn't want to be with aside from money. If he had been poor, he would have been a very poor marriage choice for her aside from the money. And then when it came down to actually getting married, she still married him even though her heart belonged to Henry Crawford, because he had stolen her heart intentionally, knowing that she was an engaged woman. And then she went off and had an affair with him because Fanny Price said no to him. So it's just one of those things where, yeah, I think where this whole thing should have fallen apart is where she met Henry Crawford. She should have turned down the marriage. She should have ended there and left him at that point instead of going through with the marriage. Now, I also want to say I don't know for sure that Henry Crawford did go cheat go help her cheat on her husband because of Fanny Price, but I think that's what would happen. That's my personal opinion. But also, I do also want to say that I think Henry is a great, interesting character. I think he is a very well-rounded villain, if we want to call him a villain, as I think he's supposed to be in this book. But I also think he is someone who brings up a lot of debate and a lot of conversation. I don't think he'd be reformed, though. I think his eye would have been settled on Fanny for a little while, but then he would have been wandering, and she would have been married to a husband who cheats for life. And I don't think she would have ever been with someone who's happy with her. So I'm glad she didn't end up with with Henry Crawford. I have been looking up villains, shall we say, in Jane Austen for this video idea, for this review, just to make sure I had all my facts right before I started talking about anything. And I also want to talk about the way that Henry is introduced, because I feel like calling him Henry, and that's something else about this, where A lot of Jane Austen's heroes and villains are introduced in kind of formal ways. We have 3 villains who are introduced in very formal ways, being Mr. Willoughby, Mr. Wickham, and then Mr. Elliot. And then we have 3 who are not, being Mr. Crawford, being Henry Crawford, John Thorpe, and Frank Churchill. And I think the other 2 are explainable. So let's go over the 3 villains who are introduced by their first names, as I think that is something of note in these books, since we don't have many men introduced by their first names. John Thorpe was introduced by his first name, and I think this is because he is the brother of her best friend, and also I think this is when Jane Austen was quite young, and therefore she was, I think, kind of trying to do something different, trying to be informal. I am not Jane Austen's scholar, I'm just a lover of Jane Austen. I'm sorry if I'm getting that completely wrong, but that's my personal opinion. And so I think the way he's introduced is very different. The next one we have is Frank Churchill. And a Frank Churchill story we have about him also being born as one of the 3 children who did not have a mother growing up. So he, Emma, and Jane Fairfax all have the same identifying factor. None of them had mothers. And I think because they all have the same identifying factor, and because his father gave up the adoption rights to his aunt, I think that also helps differentiate between, like, the relationship between father and son, like making that one clear, and also making clear that he is also not his father's technical son anymore. I think that makes sense in my head. I might be totally wrong, but that just makes sense to me. In this one, we have a very different situation with Henry Crawford. He's introduced right away as Henry Crawford, and it made of note to me because it felt so intimate and personal. I want to read that section as well. Henry Crawford had, unluckily, a great dislike. He could not accommodate his sister in an article of such importance, but he escorted her with the utmost kindness into Northamptonshire, and as readily engaged to fetch her away again in a half-hour's notice whenever she was weary of the place. A few sections later, Henry was not handsome, had airs and countenance. The manner of both were lively and pleasant, and Mrs. Grant immediately gave them credit for everything. She was delighted with each, but Mary was her dearest object. So I think it's interesting that instantly we're being referred to him as Henry. I skipped over a lot about their childhood, and we get a quite in-depth review of them. I think it's also interesting that as a villain, we are introduced to him and his sister in chapter 4, which is quite early on in quite a big book, considering this is a chunker for Jane Austen. I think it's fascinating that Jane Austen gave us so much time, and that really shows that, like, Henry Crawford is really well developed. We have so much time to see him, and I think that's something else, because as I was prepping for this, I looked over every single villain in Jane Austen's work, main novels, okay? And each of them we are told about. We do not experience firsthand knowledge of them. We are not given information directly from the author themselves. We are given information through another character. So from Mr. Wickham, we are told information by Wickham, or by Darcy later on. Through Northanger Abbey, we are told information through Isabella Thorpe, or by John Thorpe. We are told information through other people, but not the author. So it's really interesting that in this one in particular, we are told by the author herself things like their childhood, things about where they lived, where they grew up, whole sections, several pages about Henry Crawford. It is just very fascinating to me that so much effort was put into this. And I honestly think that with different plotting, Jane Austen could have made him the hero of this book. It could have been done, and I think that might have been an intent, or at least a discussion point, because it's possible. I definitely think it's workable if a plot were to have happened that way. So yeah, just something of note. We have a lot of chapters with Henry Tilney, and like I mentioned in my other video about Mansfield Park, basically a rant against Edmund Bertram, as I am not fond of him as a character. Edmund is mentioned 103 times on the page, and Henry Crawford is mentioned 101 times. They are basically equal in this storyline, and I think it's a really interesting triangle then. When it comes to love triangles, what really do you want? So I do respect Fanny's choice of going with Edmund, as that's what her heart desired. I do wish that a different ending had taken place. However, I do respect it as the character's choice. So yes, I do really enjoy this one. I have been talking a lot about Mansfield Park right now, and I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. Did you read it for Jane Austen July? Have you just read it in the past and enjoyed it? Did not enjoyed it? Let me know your favorite parts in the comments down below. I would also love it, like I said before, if you would like to subscribe, and I will see you next time in another video. Bye for now.